All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. And thank you to Rabbi Malevsky and Rabbi Richter for giving the shiurim over the last couple of days. A great schus Baruch Hashem to be back with all of you. Also begin by thanking all of our sponsors. Thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tammuz. Rabbi Naftali Tilson of our Yisrael for dedicating all the Shir and Drushos this month in commemoration of the yard sites of his parents, Rabbi Yonah ben Avraham Leib and Rivka Bas Yaakov. We hope that the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, and the families in Nechama. We thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Aaron and Alana Weinberg, for dedicating the Week of Learning with gratitude to Hashem on the 12th anniversary of the refuah of their son, Yonatan Shai. In Meretz Hashem, this young man should continue to live a life of refuah, gizund, ad mea ve'esrim shanim tovos. To thank our Day of Learning sponsors, Israel Oppenheimer, in memory of his mother, Minnie Barov Oppenheimer, and his aunt, Esther Gutman, Zichron Lebrach. We hope that the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, and the families in Nechama. But with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Samech Gimel 63, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Samech Beis Amud Beis 62b, and we are picking up 4 lines up from the bottom. So some very interesting cases today. Itmar, have Illigitiment. So we'll say here's the case. The common denominator among the cases that we're going to see today are cases in which the woman goes ahead and sends a shaliach under one particular framework, and then the shaliach goes ahead and changes the scope of his shlichus. Changes the scope of his shlichus. The husband then responds in a particular way. So the shayla we're going to deal with is, so what's the impact of the shlichus? So the Gemara says as follows, Itmar, have Illigitiment. So just to be clear, the woman, we'll call her Rachel. Rachel's married to Reuven, they're getting divorced. So now Rachel knows she's getting her get from her husband. She says to Shaliach, bring me my get. Bring me my get. We call that a shliach laholacha. Right? So a shliach for transport, right? So ultimately, again, go ahead and just simply shliach lekabala on the other stand. So the Gemara, well, no, it's called a shliach laholacha. Remember again, a shliach lekabala is a. All right, let me start with this. I'm going for a couple of days. Why am I getting so many blank stares? Right? We're getting. This is on. Okay. So remember again. So we have a shliach laholacha. Shliach laholacha simply means a shliach whose job it is to transport the get. Right? So a husband can make a shliach laholacha, right, to transport the get to his wife. A wife can make a shliach laholacha, ultimately again to go ahead and pick up the get from her husband. Then there's a shliach lekabala. Right? Shliach lekabala ultimately again is where the shaliach becomes an extension of the woman herself to receive the get on behalf of the wife. The nafkamina, the difference between those two types of shlichos is what? In the shliach laholacha, the woman is divorced when the get reaches her hand. In the shliach lekabala, ultimately because the shaliach is an extension of the woman herself, as soon as the shaliach receives the get, she is divorced. To the point, by the way, even if that get never makes it to her. Let's say the get, for whatever the reason, shliach goes on vacation, the get gets destroyed. Once the shaliach receives the get, ultimately the woman herself is divorced. Okay, so now, watch what's happening over here. So the Gemara says one more time, Itmar, have Illigitiment. So Rachel is saying to shaliach, bring me my get. Bring me my get. Shliach laholacha. Shliach laholacha. Fine. Now remember, Shaliach shows up the husband, to Reuven, and he says to her, V'ishtecha amrali hiskaba ligiti. Now, what's happened over here is the Shaliach claims to the husband that what? He's a Shliach lekabala. Okay, Shliach lekabala. Now, whether the Shaliach is purposely misrepresenting himself or the Shaliach is going ahead and just making a mistake, whatever it is, it's really immaterial. The point over here is the Shaliach is actively misrepresenting the nature of his shlichus. He's claiming to be a Shliach lekabala. What does Reuven say? V'hu omer, holich kimasha amra. Reuven says, okay, essentially, take the get, transport the get as she told you. As she told you. So Amrav Nachman, so we'll say, so now what? So Shaila is, what's going on over here? So Rav Nachman says, name of Rav, name of Rav, Afilu higia get liyada eina mikureshes. Even if the get reaches her hands, right? Ultimately, again, she is not divorced. She's not divorced. They will say, now why is that? Why is that? So the Gemara wants to suggest, Shma mina adibura didei kasamich. It must be because I will say the husband is depending on the words of the shaliach. So what's happened over here? The shaliach has gone ahead and changed the parameters of his shlichus. He was engaged to be a shliach la'olacha. Instead, again, he's claiming to be a shliach lekabbalah. I will say when a shaliach redefines the terms of his shlichus, then what does he do? What does he do? Effectively, he terminates his shlichus. When a husband hears this from the shaliach, the husband puts his trust that whatever the shaliach is telling me is indeed what my wife wanted. So because the shaliach has effectively terminated the essence of his shlichus, so therefore again, there's no shlichus. If there's no shlichus, then what? Then what? Then there's no get. Then there's no get. So if Rav Nachman says, even if the get ends up making it to the woman herself, at the end of the day, she is not divorced. The Gemara says, you see from here that halacha l'maisa, the husband really relies on the words of the shaliach himself to represent himself correctly. So the Gemara says, because if at the end of the day, we say that the husband really relies on his wife's or soon-to-be ex-wife's words, she should at least be divorced when the get reaches her hands. Right? Because after all, remember again, both say, how did she engage the shaliach? How did she engage the shaliach? As a shliach la'olacha, just as a regular transport shliach. So the Gemara says, Rav Ashi. So we'll say, so this is the position of Rav Nachman, that we're going to spend a significant amount of time over the course of Amud Aleph trying to question. So essentially what Rav Nachman is telling us is like this. So we'll say, so here's the case. We have a woman who engages a shaliach to transport the get from her husband to her. That's it. Shaliach shows up. He tells the husband, Ruvain, I'm a shliach lekabbalah. Shliach lekabbalah. Ruvain says, take the get as she told you to take it. Okay, Rav Nachman says she's never divorced. Even if the get reaches her hands, she's not divorced. Rav Nachman says, why not? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, that the husband relies on the shaliach, on the shlichus, as put forward before him by the shaliach. And since the shaliach changed the terms of his shlichus, therefore ultimately the shlichus is void. Amar Rashi, Hagi Ashta, so Bishlama, so it comes along Rav Ashi, and Rav Ashi says like this. Bishlama I itmar ipcha. The truth is, it would have been better had Rav Nachman said the opposite case. What's the opposite case? Hiskabel Gittin, that the woman would write, Rachel told the shaliach, we'll say Samach Gimel Amud Aleph, second line, Hiskabel Gittin, V'ishtecha amra havi ligiti. Now we'll say, so it comes along Rav Ashi said, the truth is, the case would have been better illustrated in the opposite way. What happens? Rachel said, Bi shliach lekabbalah. That's what Rachel said. Now, Shaliach shows up to Reuven and he says, V'ishtecha amra have ligiti. So now Shaliach portrays himself as a delivery shliach, la'holacha, v'hu omer heilach kimasha amra, and Reuven would have said heilach. Now, also remember again, we're going to distinguish today between holech and heilach, right? Holech means take it. Heilach means the get is before you, get it done. Hey, look. In other words, people think, when you hear it, you think heilach also means like holech. Heilach is a contraction of two words. Hey, this, lach is now before you. So I will say, so now watch this. V'hu omer heilach kamasha amra. Husband says, okay, just take it as he told you. Take it as he told you. So I will say, so now Rav Nachman bar Avua says, Amarav, kevan she'egia get liado migureshes. Ultimately, again, once the get gets to his hands, the hands of the shaliach, she should be migureshes. Why? Alma adibura dida hudika samech. Ultimately, again, because what do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, we rely on her words. In other words, I will say, a husband understands that when the shaliach is coming before him, and the shaliach has been constituted by the woman, by the wife, so that those are the terms of the shliachos that should be in effect. So ultimately, again, in this type of case also, she constituted the shliachos as a shliach lekabbalah. The shliach is changing it around, ultimately, again, the shliach le'alacha. So ultimately, again, as soon as the get reaches his hands of the shliach, she should be divorced, because that's how she constituted the shliachos. Inami, the other possibility is liada say that she's divorced only when the get gets to her hands, adibura didei kasamech, because then the husband will be relying ultimately again on the words of the shaliach himself. Alahacha, so the point the Gemara is making is these would be good cases to illustrate Rav Nachman's din. The original case is not good. So what was the original case? Original case was she made him a shliach laholacha. He then what? Made himself into a shliach lekabbalah. See, I both say that case doesn't work. Why? Elahacha mishum da'akre shliach l'shlichusei legamre, hu da'amar shliach lekabbalah havina lahalacha lo avina. See, I both say the reason why the first case that the Gemara started with is not a good case is because I will say when you are a shliach lekabbalah, a shliach lahalacha, and you make yourself into a shliach lekabbalah, that's a different animal. That's a different animal. And by doing that effectively, what you've done is you've terminated the parameters of, or you've dissolved the parameters of your shlichus. So I'll say, I want to show you why this doesn't go both ways. When you are made to be a shliach lekabbalah, right, and you become a shliach laholacha, I will say, those two shlichus do not overlap, right? In other words, a shliach laholacha is a courier, A shliach lekabbalah is an extension of the mishaliach. So I will say, so understand, those two things don't overlap. So when you portray yourself as a shliach lekabbalah, even though you're only a shliach lahalacha, what you've done is you've terminated the parameters of your shlichus. Now, what about the reverse? When you're a shliach lekabbalah, right, and you portray yourself as a shliach laholacha, have you terminated the parameters of your shlichus? No, because one can make the argument that embedded within being a shliach lekabbalah is also what? A shliach laholacha. Right, because part of your shlichus is you're going to bring the get back. So therefore, again, what's interesting is, even though you're misrepresenting yourself from a shlichus perspective, it's not considered to be a dissolution of the parameters of your shlichus. So I will say it's incredible. So the Gemara says that's why the first case shouldn't work at all, because when you go ahead and you're really only a shliach laholacha, and you portray yourself as a shliach lekabbalah, what you're doing is fundamentally uprooting the parameters of your shlichus, thereby dissolving them. Tashma, ha'omer hiskabel get zeli ishti. So can I listen to this? Oh wait, so a man says, so now we're reversing a little bit. So up until now we were talking about where the shaliach is the shliach of the woman, and again he's misrepresenting his shlichos of Rachel to Ruvain. Now I will say a different case. Ha'omer hiskabel get zeli ishti. Husband says, Ruvain says to shaliach, accept this get on behalf of my wife. O holich get zeli ishti, or take this get to my wife. Rotza lachzar yachzar. If the husband, I will say, even after handing over the get to the shaliach, if the husband wants to go ahead and renege, he could do so. So the Gemara says, time b'deratza. Now the reason that he can negate the get, or that he could cancel the get, is because he wants to. Halo ratza, which we can infer from that, I will say, if the husband doesn't intervene, have a get, the get would be good. Va'amai, habal lav bar shav yishliach lekabbalah. We'll say, but one second, there are two cases there, right? Case number one is husband is saying, "Iskabel get zeli ishti," accept this get on behalf of my wife. And I will say that's a shliach lekabbalah. A husband doesn't have the ability to make a shliach lekabbalah. So why should that case work at all? I will say this is incredible. Ela amrinon kevan shenasan einav legarsha. Once a husband wants to divorce his wife, Meimar Amar, he says, Tigaresh kolhechi dimegarsha. So I'll say this is fascinating. Once a husband wants to divorce his wife, so what does he say? He says like this, I want to employ whatever mechanism I can to affect this divorce. That's my goal. So let's not get too involved in the word choices over here, right? Lamaisa, what I mean is to create a shlichus which is going to result in the divorce of my wife. Whatever kind of shlichus will do that, ultimately, again, that's the kind of shlichus I want to affect. So therefore, I will say, even though he uses the lashon of his skabel, which is a shliach lekabbalah, again, could a husband make a shliach lekabbalah? Does he have that ability? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So Gemara says, he doesn't mean to use that lashon. What he means to say is, I need to get this get to my wife. Whatever type of mechanism is going to work in order to do that, then let's do that. So to in our case over here, since he wants to divorce her, Meimar Amar Tigarish Kol Hechi Dimegarsha. And I will say we should say that ultimately, again, let her get divorced, whatever mechanism. In other words, the Gemara is going back now to Rav Nachman's original statement. In other words, I will say, so the shliach comes. Let's go back for just a moment. The shliach comes, and the shliach goes ahead and misrepresents his shlichus, right? So essentially, what the Gemara is saying is, who cares? Who cares, right? And as long as what the husband essentially wants is divorce to happen. So whatever way divorce is going to happen, say whatever you're supposed to be, just be. Whatever you're supposed to be, just be, and get the divorce done. To which the Gemara says it doesn't work, and I'll tell you why. Hachi hashta hasam adam yodeh shein shlichos lekabala. See, I will say here's the difference. In the case that we just mentioned right above, even if the husband is making the shliach into a shliach lekabala, every husband knows that a husband can't make a shliach lekabala. Everyone knows that, right? The Gamar v'nasan l'shem holacha. So I will say, so his intention, even though he's using a lashon of Kabbalah, what he means is what? What he means is halacha, hachatai. So I will say the concern about the first case. Remember again, what was the first case? The first case is where the woman made the shliach into a shliach la'olacha. Shliach represented himself as a shliach l'Kabbalah. Husband says, fine, take the get as she told you to. Here I will say there's a real issue of just mistake, right? There's a real issue over here that the husband just is mistaken in what is happening over here because the shliach is misrepresenting himself. So the cases are not similar. Amar Rava, Tashma, Ketana Shamr Hiskaba Ligiti, Eino Get. So it's an interesting case. Let's say you have a Ketana who's married, right? Which you could have, again, father married her off or brother married her off. I will say, so a Ketana who's married, and she says to Shaliach, Bima Shliach LeKabbalah. So what's the halacha? Eino get, achi get liyada. So we'll say, remember again, a ketana doesn't have the ability to make a shliach lekabbalah. Therefore, she is not divorced until the get gets to her hand. But when the get gets to her hand, ultimately again, she is divorced. Va'amai. So we'll say, but here's the problem. When the husband gives the shliach the get, what does he think he's doing? He thinks he's giving it to a shliach lekabbalah, right? But because remember again, that's how the kitana, that's how the minor wife went ahead and established this shlichus. Be my shliach lekabbalah. Shliach shows up to Reuven and says, "I'm the shliach lekabbalah." Husband says, okay, right? Gives it to him, gives it to the shliach. But at the end of the day, he's not a shliach lekabbalah. So the Gemara says, "Va'amai v'hala shliach la'olacha shavya." Ultimately, again. He didn't make it Mashiach La'olacha, El Aminon, Kevan Shenasan Einav Legarsha, Meimar Amar Tigarish Kol Hechi Dimegarsha. I will say, see, the Gemara is now operating with this principle that essentially, once husband decides to divorce his wife, so essentially what he says is, let her get divorced in any way in which divorce can actually happen. So the Gemara says, so therefore, Hachanami Kivan Shnasan Inav Lagarsha, Meimar Amar Tigarish Kol Hechi Dimegarsha. So we'll say, why do we say the same thing over here? We keep going back to Rav Nachman's case on the bottom of Amud Beis. Even though the shliach is misrepresenting himself, right? She made him a shliach la'olacha. He's claiming, my whole life I always wanted to be a shliach lekabbalah, right? So now he's misrepresenting himself as a shliach lekabbalah. So the Maisa, why don't we just say, let's not get caught up in this. The husband's das is, let her get divorced in any way in which divorce could actually occur. So we'll say, I tell you why the Gemara says the keys are not similar. Hachi ashta hasam adam yodea she'ein shlichus lekatan. So we'll say, this is incredible. When Reuven is divorcing his wife Rachel, and Rachel is a kitana, and now Shaliach shows up and claims to be a shliach lekabbalah, Reuven says, no you're not, because everyone knows ein shlichus lekatan, right? Ultimately, again, a katan can't make a shaliach. Therefore, v'gamar v'nasan l'shum holacha. And therefore, I will say, because the husband knows that a ketana, a katan, can't make a shliach, he understands the shliach is misrepresenting himself, or maybe his wife made a mistake, and therefore, he reforges the shlichos, and ultimately, again, makes the shaliach into a shliach laholacha. And therefore, again, that's why the case works. Hachatai. I will say, going back to the first case of Rav Nachman, the real concern over here is, when the shaliach shows up representing himself as a sheikh like Kabbalah, right? Husband has no reason not to believe him, so gives it to him with that intent. That's a mistaken intent, and maybe that in fact undermines the entire effectiveness of the get. I'll just tell you something absolutely beautiful. I saw brought down in the name of the Shem Mishmuel, the Rebbe of Sakachav. So he asked, mostly we're familiar with this concept of ein shlichus lekatan. Right? There's no shlichus for a katan. So again, it's a very simple halachic concept. Shlichus requires, agency requires das. Right? A katan, capacity. A katan doesn't have das. And therefore, if you don't have das, you can't make shlichus, can't create agency. So the Rebbe says something so beautiful. He says, on a hashkafic level, he says, what does shlichus represent? What does shlichus represent? He says, shlichus represents the ability to have a hashba, the ability to have an influence on someone else. Right? That's shlichus, right? I go over to a person and I say, I want you to be an extension of me. So that's hashba, the ability to influence other people in this world. So the Rebbe says something so beautiful. The Rebbe says, everyone knows, she'ein shlichus lekatan. We'll say, a person who is small in his own eyes. A person who feels that he is insignificant, a person who feels that he doesn't matter, a person who feels ultimately, again, that he lacks value, doesn't have the ability to have a hashba, doesn't have the ability to have a proper influence upon others. If you think you're a nothing, then you'll never be able to influence your children, you'll never be able to influence your mishpacha, you'll never be able to influence your community, you'll never be able to influence anyone. Because if you think you're a nothing, then ultimately, again, it's that nothing-kite that you project to all those around you. That, says the Rebbe of Sakachav, is the deeper meaning of ein shlichus lekatan. If you think you're nothing, if you think you're just a katan, you can never make a shliach. You'll never be able to have a hashba upon anyone around you. Such a beautiful idea. Any event, they're both say. So back to the technical idea, but everyone knows, husband knows that halacha l'maisa, ein shlichus lekatan. He knows it's a mistake, therefore he reforms it. Tashma, havei ligiti. Was another case, right? Havei ligiti. So the case over here is Rachel says to the shaliach, bring me my get. Shliach lo lacha, ve'ishtecha amris kabel ligiti. And I will say, shliach goes to the husband. And shliach says to the husband, your wife made me into a shliach lekabbalah. Or the opposite, his kabel ligiti. Wife says, be my shliach lekabbalah. Shliach comes to the husband and he says, ve'ishtecha amra havei ligiti. Your wife told me to be a shliach laholacha. Right? V'hu amar holech v'tein. And he's right. And now husband says to the shliach, okay, take it and give it to her. Or we'll say, so a couple of different lashonos, holech v'tein or zochila, right? Zochila v'skabela, or ultimately again acquire it for her, right? Zochila means zochila, right? Zochila acquired for her, skabel, receive it for her, ratza lachzar yachzar. In all of these cases, if the husband wants to retract, he can retract. However, mishegia get liadam migureshes. Once the get gets to her hands, ultimately again she is migureshes. My love, akabola, v'olacha, oholacha. Now, both say, now, the Pashtos, there's a whole bunch of cases mixed in over here. Is he not using the Lashonos of Kabbalah for Kabbalah and holacha for holacha? Lo, Kabbalah aholacha, v'olacha akabola. Rabbi said, rather, he could be using different Lashonos for different things. Kabbalah olacha, so 1 second. If he's using the Lashon of Kabbalah, when the Shaliach represented himself as a Sheikh La'olacha, Michi mate gita liyada li'alter lehavi gita. Then ultimately, again, once the get gets to her hands, she should be divorced immediately. Because I will say, in that case, what he's actually doing is he's aligning his words with her original intent. Shamas mina dadibura didei kasamich. It must be, Rabbi say, once again going full circle, that when the shaliach represents himself, Rabbi say, that is what the husband relies on. Right? The husband, right? In other words, when the shaliach shows up and says, I am this type of shaliach, husband says, okay, I'm relying on you, shaliach, that whatever you say is the truth. To which the Gemara says, Rabbi say, so once again, Hasam ka'amrale heilach kimasha amra. Hachami amrale heilach kimasha amra. So now the Gemara wants to make a distinction and wants to say that we're talking over here about a case of heilach. So we'll say the case over here is where he says to her, heilach kimasha amra. take this get and do in accordance with what my wife told you to do. But in the case we'll say over here, did he ever say Halach? Not at all. So we'll say, so now the Gemara, once again, this has come up already a couple of different times. Difference in the case of Holech versus Halach. We're going to see this in Mirat Hashem if we have time today in the Rambam. Tarabanan, Hiskabel Giti, V'ishtecha Amra, Hiskabel Giti. Okay, so we'll say, so now this is actually a case of alignment of intent, right? She said, right? So Rachel says, Be my shliach lekabbalah. Shliach shows up, and what does he say? I am a shliach lekabbalah. Great. V'hu omer, holech v'tein la. Now we'll say, in this case, what does husband do? Husband transforms the shlichus. Husband says, no, I don't want you to be a shliach leholacha. A shliach lekabbalah. I want you to be my shaliach leholacha. Okay. So we'll say, v'hu omer, holech v'tein la, zochila v'skabbalah. Ratza lachzor lo yachzor. So we'll say in this case, if he says to holech v'teila or zachila v'skabela, ultimately if he wants to go ahead and renege, he can't renege. Rabbi Nassan omer holech v'seila ratza lachzor yatzar. Rabbi Nassan says it depends. If he says to the shaliach holech, take the get and give it to her, then if he wants to renege, he could renege. Because we'll say, what has he done in that case? In that case, he's transformed the shliach from her shliach lekabbalah to his shliach leholacha. However, zachila v'skabela, but if he says to the shaliach, acquire the get for her, right, receive it for her, ratza lachzor lo yachzor. Ultimately, again, if he wants to renege, he doesn't have the ability to renege. Rabbi says, bekulan, im ratza lachzor lo yachzor. Rabbi says in all of these cases, if he wants to renege, he doesn't have the ability to renege. Aval im amar lo ievshi shetekabela ela holech v'tein la. But however, we'll say, if he does say, I do not want you to be a shliach lekabbalah, rather, all I want you to do is be a shliach leholacha, take the get to her, then, ratza lachzor yachzor. Then if he wants to renege, he could renege. Rabbi Hainu Tanakama. We'll say, Rabbi is saying the same thing as Tanakama, saying the same idea. Rabbi say, Rabbi is coming to talk about the case of EFC. And what Rabbi is trying to introduce to us, I will say, is that you could have a case where Rachel sends a shaliach to the husband to be a shliach lekabbalah, and what happens? Husband has the ability to transform that shaliach into a shliach leholacha, right? In a couple of different ways. Well, according to Rabbi, in one way, he has to actually articulate EFC. I do not want you to be a shliach lekabbalah, rather I want you to be a shliach leholacha, and that's what Rabbi's coming to teach us. Other possibilities, what's going to teach us? Who's the Tanakama? Tanakama himself is Rabbi. Fine. So so now I'll say the Gemara asks, Heilach, the Rabbi Nassan kizachi dami, olav kizachi dami. So I will say, according to Rabbi Nassan, what do you do with the lashon of Heilach? Is Heilach, I will say lashon of Heilach, is Heilach considered to be a lashon of zachi, acquire it on her behalf, olav kizachi dami, or not. So tashma, haomer eskabel getzel ishti. If a man says to the shaliach, become the shliach lekabbalah for my wife, which I will say, of course, doesn't work. Oh, holech getzel ishti, or take this get to my wife. Ratza lachzor yachzor. If he wants to renege, he could renege. So I'll say, so remember again, because in both of those cases, remember, husband never has the ability to make a shliach lekabbalah. The most he can do is make a shliach leholacha. That's the most he could do. However, ha'isha sha'amra hiskabel ligiti. But if a woman says, receive the get on my behalf, ratza lachzor lo yachzor. Then I will say, once he gives the get to the Isha, he does not have the ability to renege, because that shliach has received it as a shliach lekabbalah. Amud beis, my love behelach, the Rabbi Nassan. Are we not talking about the case of Osai of Heilach? According to Rabbi Nassan, to which the Gemara says, lo baholech the Rebbe. Not necessarily Osai, ultimately, and it could be talking about a case of holech in accordance with the position of Rebbe. Fine. So we'll say we're going to see in the Rambam the distinction between Heilach and Holech in just a little bit. So Tashma, we'll say second line down from the top, Samach Gimel Amud Beis 63b. Tashma, Lefichach, Im Amar Lo Habal Ef Shishet Kabbalah. If the husband says to the Shaliach, I don't want you to be Shach LeKabbalah, Ela holech v'tein. Rather, what I'm okay with is you taking it ultimately again and giving it to her. Rotza lachzor yachzar. Ultimately, again, if he wants to renege, he could renege. Why? Taima damar efshi. The reason he could renege is because ultimately the husband says efshi. Ha lo amar efshi. But if he doesn't say efshi, rotza lachzar lo yachzar. So I'll say, interestingly enough, if he doesn't say efshi, he doesn't have the ability to go ahead and renege. Now, why is that? My love behelach. Rabbi say, is it not a case of helach v'Rabbi Nasan? Lo b'holech v'Rabbi. Again, Rabbi say, once again, the Gemara keeps trying to prove this point of helach according to Rabbi Nasan, but it doesn't work. Tashma, holech get zeli ishti. Right, husband says, take this get to my wife. Rotza lachzo yachzer. If he wants to renege, he could renege. Helach get zeli ishti. But Rabbi say, if he says helach, then rotza lachzor lo yachzor. If he wants to renege, he doesn't have the ability to renege. Rabbi say, why? What does that sound like? Man shamasei damar b'holech rotza lachzor yachzor. Who says that by a case of holech, which we're interpreting as meaning just straight transport, that if you want to renege, you could renege? Rabbi Nasan. V'ka'amar b'helach rotza lachzor lo yachzor. Rabbi say, by helach, it sounds like that's what? Helach, if the husband wants to renege, he can't renege. Who says that? Shma mina helach kischi dami shma mina. Rabbi say, what do you see from here? That lashon of helach, the distinction between holech and helach. Holech means transport. Because it just means transport, therefore what? If the husband wants to renege, he has the ability to do so. Helach sounds like what Rabbi say? Helach sounds like zichi, acquire it on behalf of the Isha, which Rabbi say we'll have to see exactly how that works. See, in the Rambam, Helach kischi dami. Helach sounds like acquired on her behalf, in which case, again, so husband does not have the ability to renege, shma mina. And indeed, Rabbi say this seems to be the conclusion. Itmar. Let's just do a few more cases, then we'll see the Rambam. Itmar, hiskaba legiti. So Rabbi say, so once again, wife is saying, bima shliach lekabbalah. Shliach shows up to the husband. V'ishtecha amra hiskaba legiti. Okay, good news, right? Alignment, shlichos alignment. She's saying bima shliach lekabbalah. He's representing himself as a shliach lekabbalah. V'hu omer helech. Now we'll say in this case, husband is saying, holech, go ahead and take it. Go ahead and take it. Rabbi says shliach la'olacha. Holech l'tzein la. Amar Rabbi Abba. Amar Rav Huna. Amar Rav. Nase shlucho u'shlucha v'chol letzes. So Rabbi say, this is actually an interesting case. So now Rabbi Abba says the name of Rav Huna, says the name of Rav. Rabbi say this is a case ultimately again where the shaliach is her shaliach and his shaliach. Rabbi say now why is that? What's happening over here is as follows: is a reformulation of shlichus. She's sending the shaliach as what? As a shliach lekabbalah. He's saying, husband is saying, I don't want you to be a shliach lekabbalah. I want you to be a shliach laholacha. So now Rav says it works. Husband is his shaliach and her shaliach, but ultimately again there's chalitza. Now what does this mean? Take a look at Rashi, 3 lines down from the top. Nasa shlucho ushlucha v'chol lazes im meis habal kodem she'egia get liyada choletzes lo mevzeh. So so now watch this. If halacha l'maisa the get gets to her hands, so fine, she's divorced. That's not a chiddush because she'd be divorced regardless. But we'll say, what happened in the following situation? Okay, so let's play this out, right? So Rachel says the shliach, be my shliach lekabbalah. Shliach shows up to Ruvain, says, I'm the shliach lekabbalah. Ruvain says, no, you're not. Now you're my shliach laholacha. Ruvain gives the shliach the get. Shliach is on his way back. He dies. And the get, right? The get gets shliach dies, and the get gets lost. The get is lost. So the get never reaches Rachel's hands. Get never reaches Rachel's hands. So I will say, so now what? I'm sorry. Actually, let's say that differently. No. So husband dies. Sorry. Right. So one more time. Okay. I'm sorry. One more time. Rachel says to her shliach, "Bina shliach lekabbalah." Shliach shows up to Ruvain. Says Ruvain, Shalom Aleichem, I am your wife's shliach lekabbalah. Ruvain says, thank you, you're no longer my wife's shliach lekabbalah, now you are my shliach leholacha. Shliach says, listen, as long as I'm getting paid, I'll be whatever you want, right? So no problem, right? I'll be a shliach leholacha, so what happens? He receives the get. Fine. He's on his way back to Rachel. During the journey back to Rachel, we'll say what happens? Reuven dies. Now Reuven dies without children. So Rabbi said, listen to this. So Rav says in this particular case, halacha l'maisa, Rachel is going to have to do chalitza. Rachel's going to have to do chalitza. Look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, Nasa shlucha u'shlucha v'choletzes. Emeis habal kodem she'egia get liada choletzes v'lo misyavemes. She'll have to do chalitza and no yibum. Now I will say what this sounds like over here. Is halacha l'maisa. Had the get reached Rachel's hands, we would be done. Right? The issue over here is husband died before the get reached her hands. So because of that, ultimately, again, she's going to have to do chalitza and she's not allowed to do yibum. Lememra, what does it say? Lememra, the mesafka le'lerab, I holich kischi dami, ilav kischi dami. So I will say what it sounds like over here is that Rav is musubak. What is the lashon of holich? Does holich mean acquired on her behalf or don't acquire it on her behalf? So but we learned holich mana leploni shani chayev lo. You know, I will say we learned in a similar case, right? Reuven borrowed $1,000 from Shimon, and now he says to the shaliach, holich mana leploni, take this money back, right? Reuven says, take the $1,000 back to Shimon because I'm obligated to him. Amarav chayev bach liyuso. So Rav says the shaliach is chayiv, is responsible for that money, right? Ultimately, again, so if the shliach loses the money, the shliach is responsible. Furthermore, and if after Reuven gives the shliach the $1,000 to give back to Shimon, Reuven has a change of heart. He doesn't want to repay Shimon. What's talacha? He can't renege on the shlichos. So I will say, what do you see from here? You see from here that holich is kischi. If that's the case, then halacha l'maisa, when husband Reuven gave the get to Shaliach and said holich, Shaliach should acquire it on Rachel's behalf, and even if Reuven died before the get got to her hands, she should not be chayiv in chalitza or anything. She's divorced. To which the Gemara says, no. Hasam safek mamon lekula, hacha safek isura lechumra. I will say in reality it's a safek. What do we do with holich? Right? Is holich kischi? Is holich not kischi? It ultimately again is a safek. So I'll say in general, when it comes to a safek mamon, safek in monetary matters, we'll go lekula. So therefore I will say we're not sure is holich kischi, not kischi. We'll say that once Reuven gives the $1,000 to repay Shimon to the shaliach, ultimately we'll say holich is kischi, and therefore he can't get it back. In the case of Osai Gittin, we are dealing with an Isra Erva, right? And literally, again, a Safek Isura, so there will have to be much more Machmir. And ultimately, again, we're not sure as Holich Kisri, not Kisri. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, we would make her do chalitza in that case where the husband died before the get reached her hands. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Amarav. So we'll say, so fine. Let's just pause here. Let's just pause here for just a moment, because now we're going to get up into a new sugya. So I will say, let's just catch up a little bit on Rambam. So I will say, so what do we do in these cases where the shaliach misrepresented himself, right? Because that's really how we started out in these cases of Rav Nachman. So the Rambam discusses, it says in Hilchos Gerushin, Perek Vav, Halacha Yud, Ha'isha she'asta shaliach lekabala, v'amar lo abal in ritzoni shetekabala gita elahari zegi So I'll say, so now listen to this. Now, halacha l'maisa, a husband has the ability to reform shlichus. Some goes a little bit out of order over here from the Gemara, right? So ultimately, again, so if a shaliach l'kabbalah shows up at the husband has the ability to say, no, I'm making you into a shliach l'holacha. So that he has the ability to do, which makes sense because since the get is a husband-driven process, he has the ability to determine the mechanism, the delivery mechanism. So if he doesn't want it to be a shliach l'kabbalah, wants to be a shliach l'holacha, he could reforge the identity of that shaliach. Fine. Aval, and I will say now, aval im amar hiskabel lagida o heilach o zechela lo akar shlichas l'kabbalah. So I'll say, so fine. Now halacha l'maisa. However, so that's the case really was out of order a little bit. Case number one is shliach l'kabbalah shows up at the husband and says, I'm a shliach l'kabbalah. So if the husband says, heilach, or he says, acquire it, then fine. Essentially, he says, fine. So a husband could choose to use that delivery mechanism. However, if shaliach shows up and says, I'm a shliach like Kabbalah, but he says to her, holech la, right? Ultimately, again, that in and of itself is an uprooting of the shliach. So we'll say, according to the Rambam, if shliach like Kabbalah shows up and he says, Heilach, way we interpret Heilach is, here is the get before you, do with it as she instructed you to do. That is a confirmation of the shlichos lekabbalah. If he says holech la, then I will say holech la is considered to be an uprooting of the shlichos lekabbalah, is a lashon of shlichos laholacha. That's how the Rambam paskins. Now I will say ultimately again, so that's case one. So in case one, essentially, what we learn is, number one, if shliach shows up to be a shliach like Kabbalah and husband chooses to use that mechanism, that's fine. Case two, shliach like Kabbalah shows up. If husband says heilach, that's confirmation. Holech is a reformulation into a shlichos laholacha, and that's based on the fact that the husband has the ability to reforge the agency of the shaliach who shows up. Now I will say the chiddush in that is, even though this agent was appointed by who? Was appointed by the woman. Husband has the ability to go ahead and reframe the parameters of his shlichos. Now, I will say, what about the next case? Right? Shliach ha'isha shabal l'kabel get min habal v'amr shliach kabalani v'omer lo habal holek ezek mashamra kolomar eini okasha. Right. So what I say? So case number two is where she, right? Isha, I'm just going to do it outside because Rambam Lashon is longer. Case number two is where she appointed him as a shliach laholacha. He decided to become ultimately again shliach lekabbalah. Right? Even if the husband affirmed that shlichus, the Rambam paskins, eina migurashas. Ultimately, again, she's not divorced. Why is she not divorced in that case? Because he totally uprooted the parameters of his shlichus, right? She made him into a regular courier, right? He made himself into a shliach lekabbalah. You can't do that. Now I will say, even if the husband said, okay, be a shliach lekabbalah, it doesn't work because l'maisa again, he uprooted the parameters of his shlichus. The third case, where the shliach ultimately said, I'm a shliach lekabbalah, shliach laholacha, right? And then what? Husband says, okay, it turns out that wife actually appointed him as a shliach lekabbalah. Ultimately, again, once the get reaches her hands, she's migurashas. Why? I will say because in that case, being a shliach laholacha is kind of embedded in the parameters of being a shliach laholacha. Good. So I'll say those are the three cases of the Rambam. Good. Beautiful. I'll say now with that, let's go back. There's much more to talk about in these cases, but at least now you have the basic halacha l'maisa. Amarav. Eina isha, Amarav. Eina isha osa shliach lekabbalah gita miyat shliach baila. Interesting halacha. A woman cannot appoint a shaliach to receive a get from the shaliach of her husband. Okay, so what this is just to illustrate this case over here is Ruvain is divorcing Rachel. Ruvain sends the get with the shaliach. He sends the get with the shaliach. Rav is saying that Rachel can't appoint the shaliach to receive the get from her husband's shaliach. Okay, so we'll say Rabbi Chanina says, Isha osa shliach lekabel gita miyat shliach baila. Rabbi Chanina says, yes, she can. Yes, she can. They're right. There's no reason why a woman can't use a shaliach to receive the get from her husband's shaliach. So the Gemara says, my time at the Rav. So what is going on over here? Why does Rav say that Rachel can't appoint a shaliach to receive the get from Ruvain's shaliach? My time at the Rav. So I'll say one possibility is maybe because it's considered to be disparaging to the husband. Look at Rashi. Mishum bizayin debal. Kisavar kalosi be'ineh she'ena mekablosa ba'asma. De'ilu ki avdel lekabel mi'adabal in kan chashash bizayin teyad v'lo kape. So Rabbi say, so what we're concerned about over here is maybe the husband is going to be disparaged. Right? That's what? That he's going to say what? My wife can't take the time to go ahead and receive the get directly from the shaliach. She has to appoint the shaliach to get it from the shaliach. The pashas we're referring to over here is the husband's dispatching an agent to go to her. That's what's happening over here. So now the only reason why she would be making a shaliach to go ahead and get it from the hands of his shaliach is why? Like a shtach. like a shtach. So maybe the husband's going to feel disparaged. Then I will say, so we'll say to ourselves, well, who cares if the husband feels disparaged? He'll say, we do care. Why do we care? Because if he feels disparaged, what could he do? What could he do? He could pull the plug on the entire operation. And obviously, again, the goal over here is always to get the woman her get. So Rav says, therefore, again, because if the husband feels disparaged, he may pull the plug on this. Therefore, again, we say that halacha l'maisa, a woman can't appoint a shliach to receive the get from the shliach of husband. I will say, now you look at this Gemara. What do you see from this? This is pandering to stupidity, right? So the husband's going to feel, be a big boy, right? So why don't you put on your big boy pants, right? And just go ahead and maybe she's out that day, or maybe something else. We'll see something very important over here, which is in life, very often you have to navigate around people's feelings, even if they're totally illegitimate. As I will say, so remember again, there are times when people feel, right? See, I know this is not popular with the psychologists maybe, but just because you feel a certain way does not mean it's correct, right? And just because you feel a certain way doesn't mean that the world has to go ahead and accommodate your feelings. That's true on an abstract level. But now let's talk about on a practical level, right? On a practical level, I will say, we have to deal with all kinds of people. And sometimes people act in irrational ways. Sometimes people feel certain ways about certain things that don't make any sense. So you could choose to take your principled stance on every single thing, but Lamaisa, then A, you'll probably have very few friends. But more important than friends, because it's not really important in life to have friends, what's more important is to be productive. If you don't know how to work with people and you don't know how to accommodate sometimes irrational things, then Lamaisa, you will not be an effective and productive person in this world. Life is all about navigating relationships. Relationships are often complex, and people are often just out to lunch, right? And Lamaisa, if you don't know how to navigate around that, then you'll remain fixed in the Shabbos. And this is incredible. What is Rav saying over here? What are we concerned about? We tell Rachel, do me a favor. Rachel, can you just please receive the get directly from your husband shliach? Rachel's like, why? Why, right? I have plans that day. I'm going to be out of town that day. He appointed a shliach. Why can't I appoint a shliach? And what do we say to Rachel? Rachel, Shefela, you're absolutely right. This is crazy. But what's the goal? What's the goal? The goal is to receive your get. So sometimes in life, to get the job done, you just have to deal with people's shtuyot. That's what you have to deal with. And the sooner you learn that lesson and you learn to navigate, the more effective in life you will be. An incredible yisod, I will say. So the Gemara goes right. The other possibility is, Mishum chatzera bali achar mikan. So this is very interesting. The other concern, also we've actually spoken about this. Remember this chatzera bali achar mikan? We actually had this. We'll say chatzera bali achar mikan is the following case. Two cases, right? Rachel owns property. We actually haven't seen this yet. We've seen it mentioned. We haven't learned the sugya. Ruvain takes the get, and what does he do? He throws it into the chatzar of Rachel. What's the halacha? Migurashas. What about the following case? Ruvain puts the get in a piece of property in a chatzar, and now he tells his friend Shimon, I want you to gift the chatzar to Rachel, my soon-to-be ex-wife. So the gift works. What doesn't work? The get. Why? Because they're both saying in order for kinyan chatzar to work, the chatzar has to be owned by the woman at the time the get is given. That's called chatzera haba la'achar mikan. Ultimately, again, a chatzar that came into her possession after the get was already placed there. Say for Rabosai, it could be the concern over here is that appointing a shaliach to go ahead and receive the get from the shaliach of the husband is a gzeira of chatzera haba la'achar mikan. So my binay, I both say, what's the practical difference between them? Ika binayu, the kadma'i, the shav yishteach meikara. I both say the nafkamina would be is, what if she appointed her shaliach first? So if it's a din of chatzera haba la'achar mikan, that wouldn't apply over here. Why? Because her shaliach was already in place before his shaliach. If it's a concern of bizayon the baal, the husband could still apply. Hu gavra. We'll say another interesting case, some great cases now. Hu gavra, the shadal Gittin l'dvisu. There was a man who sent the get to his wife. Azo shliach, ashkecha kiyasva v'kalisha. So we'll say, so again, Reuven's divorcing Rachel. Reuven sends a shaliach with the get. So Shliach shows up, right? And what does he find? He finds that Rachel is kneading dough. Okay. Amar la, heilach gitech. So he, right, Shliach says to Rachel, here's your get. Amar le, lihave biyadach. Do me a favor, Rachel says. I now want you to become a shliach lekabbalah, right? I'm in the middle of making challah, right? So what am I supposed to do? Like my hands, I can't receive the get right now, but I don't want to pass up on the opportunity, right? So Lamaisa, do me a favor, shliach, you become my shliach lekabbalah. You become my shliach lekabbalah. To right there, Rashi says, the biyadach, v'tiya ata shluchi lekabbalah. Right? Let's say, what a fascinating case. So let's say, does this work? Some Rav Nachman in Isel Rabbi Chanina of the Ba'ovda. So let's say, if I knew that the halacha was like Rabbi Chanina, ultimately, again, I would paskin. Right? Remember again, Rabbi Chanina, what did Rabbi Chanina just say? 7 lines up or 6 lines up. What did Rabbi Chanina just say? Rabbi Chanina said a woman could make a shaliach to receive the get from her husband's shaliach. So bepashtos, that's what this case is, right? Reuven sent the shaliach to deliver the get. Rachel wants to receive it, but like literally physically, she's kneading dough. So she says, I want to make you now into my shliach lekabbalah. So the Gemara says, so Rav Nachman says, if we paskin like Rabbi Chanina, who says that a woman can make a shaliach to receive the get from the shliach of her husband, then avdi ba'uvda, then I would say that this case should work. Amalei Rabba, whoa. V'misal Rabbi Chanina, avarat ba'ovda. Even if you're like Rabbi Chanina, you think that this could work? Ha lo chazra shlichos etzel habao. So we've actually mentioned this before as well. This is fascinating. You know, say part of the concept of shlichos is that a shaliach has to have the ability to report back to the mishaliach, to the principal, and say mission accomplished. Now, I want to point out. The shaliach is not obligated to do that. But rather what the Gemara says is the shaliach has to have the ability to do that, right? So there has to be the ability that after the shaliach finishes his shlichus, he's able to go back and say, mission accomplished. And I will say, now here's what's interesting. In this case, that couldn't happen. Why couldn't that happen? Because I will say in this case, what would happen over here is the shaliach of the Baal would cease to exist, and a new shaliach would take his place. Who's the new shaliach? Shliach lekabbalah. So Rabbi said this would be a case of ein shlichus chozer etzel habal. So what's the halacha? Shalchu lekamid Rabbi Ami. So Rabbi said, listen to this. So they sent the question for Rabbi Ami. Shalchu lehu lo chazru shlichus etzel habal. Rabbi say first white line. So Rabbi Ami seemed to say it shouldn't work. Why shouldn't it work? Because lamaisa. Any shlichos that can't return to the principal and say mission accomplished is not a good shlichos. So because of this, because the identity has been transformed, therefore the original shliach can't go back to the Baal and say mission accomplished. Therefore the transformation shlichos shouldn't work. Rabbi Chia bar Abba Amar nisyashev bedavar. Rabbi Chia bar Abba said, you know what? Let me think about this. So now they sent this kasha, but Rabbi Chia bar Abba. Rabbi Chia bar Abba says, let me sit and think. Rashi says, we'll say, by the way, what a profound Musar Haskell. We'll say sometimes when people ask us questions, right, we feel compelled to give immediate answers. And often we feel compelled to give immediate answers, even though I know deep down that answer is incorrect. There's absolutely nothing wrong with saying, let me take time to think about it and I'll get back to you. And that's true. I will say, whether that's your child who's asking, whether it's your spouse who's asking, a friend who's asking, a coworker who's asking, never anything wrong with saying, let me think on it a little bit. Nisyashev bedavar. All right, Rabbi Chia bar Abba could say, I need a little bit of time to think about it. We certainly could. So we'll say what happened. Hadru shalchul kamed Rabbi Chia bar Abba. Amar kolhani shalchulei va'azli ke'echid demesapki lehu ledidao hachanai miskabel ledidan. So we'll say, now listen to this. So they sent the question again to Rabbi Chia bar Abba. Rabbi Chia bar Abba said again, I told you, I need to think about it. The same way that you guys don't know, I don't know. So we're going to stop over here for today. It's already 6:40. We're going to stop over here for today. I'm leaving you mid-question, made a little bit of a cliffhanger. Mirat Hashem, we'll pick up with this question tomorrow, Bosai. Shkoyach. All right, Chevron Zoom, great to see everyone. Have a good day.